the 2nd. We will be starting right away. If you have any questions during the webinar, please type them into the questions section of the GoToWebinar menu, and we will try to make sure they are answered before the end. Whenever you're ready, Lionel, go ahead.
Hi, Linda. I just want to check. Can you hear me?
Go ahead whenever you're ready.
Okay, I'd like to welcome everybody to Growing Concerns for May the 2nd. We're going to start today, and we're going to start with the crops update. We're going to then go on to John Gavloski, who's going to be with us today, and he's going to talk about a few of the insect issues for this spring. Touch on a few of the ones like wireworms, cutworms, grasshoppers, and the potential flea beetle problems. And then to end it off, I'm going to talk a little bit about seed treatments. I've been getting a few phone calls from producers on the, I guess, should we be seed treating? Should we, is it warm enough? Should we, that we can get away without it? Just different things regarding seed treatments. So I'm going to just go over a few things regarding seed treatments. For this Growing Concerns, the CCA credit will be for crop management. And I guess with that, we'll get started. One of the things that happened last night in the southwest here is we had a fairly good hailstorm that went through, and as you can see from the picture, we had pretty much almost golf ball size hail. This would be just south of Souris in the Elgin area. It happened, just around, just in the evening here. Inch of rain in places, someplace half-inch of rain. So definitely something we didn't need right at this time, and kind of the odd time of year to be getting such a large hailstorm with the amount of stones on the ground. It definitely created a little bit of a panic in some areas. And these are just a few pictures we received this morning. So the storm clouds were going through pretty much all southwestern here, and I think we pretty much got hit from the border right up to Riding Mountain Park with rain. Amounts are going to vary quite a bit, but again, rainfall that we probably didn't need at this time, and some areas are actually in a situation now where we're starting to become very wet, and in some places, some of the fields are going to be at least a week before we'll be able to get back out on them, and starting to create some concern with some producers because if the rains continue, we might be looking at some fields not being sown again this year. But let's hope that the rain stops and we can get some of this crop in. Right now in the southwest, after the last couple days here of sowing, I would say we must be approaching that 15 to 20% complete. So we still have a long ways to go. It was still fairly wet in a lot of areas, and we were needing some drying time to get out on the field, and producers were just nicely getting going. So we have a lot of crop to put in the southwest yet. Got a few calls probably beginning of last week. Because we're dealing with a lot of wet soil, we're getting a lot of producers wondering, should I be planting already? What should I be doing? And so I figured I'd just throw up this slide just to remind, people regarding germination temperatures for crops as they're growing, or to get them growing in the field. And you can see that a lot of the crops will start to germinate at fairly low soil temperatures, and I would imagine we're higher than that on most of the fields. So get the crop in the ground. A lot of it that was sown in the last 2 weeks is just nicely starting to sprout, and so if we got some heat, that crop would be up fairly fast. So in these cases, I would say that right now, And especially now that we're into May, I would say if we can get on the land, we should be putting the crop in and not being too concerned about soil temperatures anymore. This was probably more of a concern a couple weeks ago when we had some decent weather and guys were wondering if they should be out there planting or not. Still getting some questions regarding winter wheat, and I think the big question coming over the past week here has been a lot of the winter wheat is getting to the stage where guys are wanting to know if they'll be going in spring right now, and I've been getting the question regarding should I be throwing a fungicide in with my my application to control leaf diseases in the winter wheat. So I just threw together a few points here. When you're out there looking at the field, first of all, determine the level of disease on the leaves, if any present at all. And in most of the fields I've been in right now, the level of disease is fairly low. Look at the overall stand and the health of the crop. A lot of cases, the crop right now is really dark green. It's stooled out a lot. We have a lot of leaf material out there, and it is fairly healthy. Make sure you determine if the damage is disease or whether it is related to frost. We definitely had a few producers that I was out there and they were seeing some damage in the leaves, and I have a slide on this right away, but it is basically showing some frost damage more than anything, and you can see the leaves where they're drying up on the tips. That's all frost damage, so really nothing you can do about it, but really the crop is growing through that no problem at all. I guess one of the ones that I do have a bit of concern with is the rotation. Last year, because of the wet conditions, we have a lot of winter wheat sowing on a lot of different kind of grounds, whether it be barley stubble, wheat stubble, canola stubble. So, I guess if your rotation is questionable, then that would definitely be a check on the side of adding a fungicide to your application. Just to remember that the half rate application is going to last about 7 days and only protects the leaves that are present at the time of application. So if we get some good growing conditions, the wheat is going to jump really fast. If we start getting some 20-degree days here, that wheat is going to be going like crazy. It's been sitting there and stooling and just kind of waiting for the right type of weather to get going. So I guess my thought is the warm weather will cause the plants to grow fast, and more than likely they'll grow any disease issues present at right now. So I would probably be putting that money in my pocket and waiting for flag leaf stage and going in at that time and applying my full rate fungicide. And maybe at that point you could be looking the money you save now going with some of the the products that have maybe a little longer residue, maybe a little bit more claim for control some of the leaf or the diseases like fusarium, and they're maybe a little bit more expensive, and you'll have the ability to go with those products. If you're out there and you're looking for leaf diseases, this is what you should be seeing. So spotting on leaves, lesions on leaves, that's what you should be seeing if you're looking for disease. And so just a kind of a comparison to the frost issues that are out there. Another kind of interesting fact on the crops update here is agrotane. We got a notice yesterday from John Hurd that they are no longer, I guess, making a claim for seed-placed fertilizer with the agrotane on it for increasing your rates of fertilizer application. And what they came out with right now is they're saying that because of the different issues that are out there, because of the way the product's being used, they're not confident, I guess, in standing behind the ability for the agrotane to not be able to or not affect the germination of the seed or affect the establishment of the crop. So in the future, they are not. They're saying that basically that they're not recommending, using high rates of nitrogen with agrotane on for seed placement. Okay, some of the other crop issues that are out there right now, we're seeing, and before the rains came down, we were definitely seeing a lot of saline areas showing up, a lot more than we've seen in the past few years, and it kind of makes sense because we had a couple of years of wet conditions, and then the last 3 or 4 months before winter we were fairly dry, so the salts are coming up, and now we get the rains that we've been getting here, so it's probably going to start washing these salts down. I don't think a lot of these areas have gotten a lot bigger than they normally are or normally have been, but I guess if you're seeing them, I would probably be just treating them similar than I would be treating the, we have in the past. Some of the areas are definitely going to maybe be a little bit bigger if there's water still standing in some of the spots. But in general, recommendation right now would be to treat it the way you would normally be treating it, and hopefully these rains that have come are going to wash the salts below the roots layer and not be as big of an issue. I guess with that, that kind of ends my my crop update. And what we'll do now is we'll turn it over to John Gavloski, who's going to give an update on the insect issues for the spring.
Hi, John.
You can hear me okay at that end?
Yes, we can. Go ahead.
Okay, awesome. Okay, so I'll get right into the insect update. And what I'd like to start with actually is diamondback moth. This is an insect that we've always been telling people doesn't overwinter or doesn't overwinter well in Manitoba. And what we get blows in. And as far as we know, that's still somewhat true. This year we had that stretch of very unseasonably mild weather in March, and for the heck of it I threw a trap up at our University of Manitoba farm near Carmen, and in late March I was collecting diamondback moths from that area. And actually the picture that you can see on your right is one of the moths that was in the trap, and you'll notice that it's in very good shape. You can see the scales, the diamond pattern on it, which to me, circumstantially anyway, suggests that we may have had an overwintering population. Again, it's not proof that we did, but it circumstantially suggests we might. And we've been getting at least some moths in our trap ever since late March, so that's quite early. Now, what that means for this year, though, right now, we don't know. It certainly doesn't suggest an outbreak. You'll recall last year we did have diamondback moth problems in July and early August, and then what happened was the diamondback moth population collapsed, and the reason it collapsed was because of a parasite called Cotesia, and what we don't know right now is how abundant our parasite population is going to be starting the season. So like I said, the diamondback moths are here early. People are getting them in their traps early. They're around, but what those numbers are like, what the parasite population is like, and how well diamondback moth establishes, those are all things that we don't know at this point. So all we can really say is things have been active early, which isn't surprising given the weather. And we'll just keep checking the traps. A lot of people have traps up now, and we'll keep checking those weekly and keep you posted as things develop. But for canola growers, just something to keep a heads up about diamondback moth. If you do see nibbling on seedlings that doesn't look like flea beetle feeding, you might want to have a look for diamondback moth just in case. But again, hard to know how serious it'll be. Now, regarding flea beetles, we are starting to see some in the field. In fact, they've been out since late March as well. And predominantly what we've been seeing is the one on the left of your screen, this small black flea beetle with the yellow stripes. It's called striped flea beetle, and that's usually one of the first flea beetle species to come out in the spring. We've actually got about 10 different species of flea beetles that'll feed on canola, but really only 2 of them usually get to problem levels. The striped one here and the other one on your right, the crucifer flea beetle, which comes out a bit later. So far, it's been mainly striped flea beetles that we've been seeing. Now, of course, the big challenge with flea beetles is really to get your crop to at least the 3 to 4 leaf stage without there being significant damage. Once you have 3 or 4 true leaves, the plants usually compensate quite well for flea beetle feeding. Prior to that, they're quite vulnerable. My worry this year is we have had a lot of early seeded canola, and as a general rule, if your canola can go from seeding date to that 3 to 4 leaf stage in, say, a month or less, then the seed treatment should be all you need to really protect you from the flea beetles. If the seed sits there for a long time, or the seedlings are growing quite slow, and 3 to 4 weeks later, you still only have a plant with a cotyledon, or say 1 or 2 true leaves, what's going to happen is the seed treatment will be wearing thin, and your plants could get more substantial flea beetle feeding, in which case you'd have to keep an eye and decide, do we do a foliar spray in addition to that seed treatment? So my heads up is for anyone who does have very early seeded canola out there, consider how quickly it's growing and whether or not that seed treatment is likely to wear out before you have those 3 to 4 true leaves. And this slide here shows you a range of levels of damage from flea beetles. Normally what we suggest is if you are somewhere between 20 and 30%, roughly about 25% of the cotyledon and leaf material is pitted by the flea beetles. That's the point where we would suggest you may need a foliar spray, especially if you still have young seedling plants. Even with the seed treatment, you get a little bit of nibbling. They have to take a bite or two before they die. So something that has, say, 10% feeding. You can see here there's a few little pits. The plants are going to compensate quite well from that feeding. That's not really of major concern. When they get up above 20, around 25%, that's when, like I said, it would be economical to make a decision to spray. The true economic injury level, the point where things are going to become quite economical, is actually around 50%. But things can go from 25 to 50 rather quickly on a hot, calm day. So that's why we suggest 25% is a reasonable threshold to be using in this case. The other thing I just want to touch on really briefly is people who have seeded a crop into standing stubble. There's lower risk of flea beetle feeding. You still want to keep an eye on things, but there's been good research to show that having some stubble, which creates a more shaded, moist environment, it makes a habitat that's less suitable for flea beetles. And let's go to my next slide here just to demonstrate this. Actually, this is research that was done in Alberta by Lloyd Osdell about 14 years ago now. And what Lloyd showed in his study, so what you've got is on your left is plots that were conventionally tilled, and on the right were zero-tilled plots. And on the y-axis here is the mean flea beetle damage per plant. So 2.5, that would mean 25% feeding, which is your economic threshold. So in his study, the damage didn't quite get to threshold, but he was getting up close to it in the conventionally tilled plots. So the higher these bars, the more damage. And you can see the difference. The conventional tillage, these are different seeding rates he was using as well. The conventional tillage did have higher flea beetle feeding than the zero-till plots. And there's been a couple experiments since that have basically repeated this, and they all show similar findings, that you do tend to get more flea beetle feeding in under conventional till than zero-till systems. Now this year there may be less stubble just because of the situation you had last year, but if you are seeding into stubble, just keep that in mind. That alone may help alleviate some of the flea beetle pressure from the field. Okay, moving on to cutworms, another early season concern. Right now we do have cutworms out and feeding. The ones that are out right now are the ones on the right of your screen. This is the dingy cutworm, this species, and it's a species that overwinters as a larva. So when things warm up in the spring, they're already there as a larva. My heads up is just to keep an eye on things. If you are seeing crop not coming up well, or coming up and there's clearly chewed chunks of the leaves gone. I mean, obviously, if it's canola, if it's pits, it's flea beetles. But if you have chunks gone from the cotyledons, think cutworm, and maybe do a little bit of digging around the area where you see them. Like I said, odds are right now it would be dingy cutworm, which doesn't do a lot of clipping of plants. It does more defoliation. So it'll come up, it'll chew the leaves. Seedlings, they can chew them to the ground, but they don't do a lot of clipping. Whereas redback cutworm, on your right, they overwinter as an egg, so they would be really small right now if they've hatched out at all. We usually have more problems with them later in May and even into June. They're a clipper, so their style of feeding, they will just clip the stem, and you've got these plants lying on the ground that look like someone took scissors to them. So that's something that would be happening later. As a couple of heads up anyway, areas to watch in the field, often you do see some of the first damage on knolls and hills, areas facing south. Things just get heated up a bit quicker. And as a rule, cutworms don't like a lot of wet soil, so they would prefer to be in areas that are a little on the drier side if there's a preference. So sometimes you do see them in patches in a field, drier areas, or areas that had a lot of flowering, either crop or weeds, the previous season, late in August. Because when the moths are laying their eggs, they like a nectar source. Sometimes if you've had a thistle patch in the field or a patch of flowering weeds late in the season, you will find the next year that's where the cutworms are. We've seen that before, particularly with dingy cutworm. I've seen that frequently enough. So there's reasons why they can be patchy, and if they are very patchy, sometimes control-wise, you just need to worry about treating a patch. The other thing I'd like to mention is there's a study going on right now through the University of Manitoba. They're trying to look at what are our local parasites of our local species of cutworms. There's also work going on in Alberta. They're doing a similar study, and this is where the picture here comes from, this little black wasp. That's one of the wasps that came out of one of their Alberta cutworms. Again, there's someone at the University of Manitoba doing a local study on this. We want to know more about what is naturally killing our local cutworms and see if there's ways that we can help to improve or create cropping situations that better promote some of these natural enemies. So my plea to you is, if you are finding cutworms in any fields, contact Lionel or myself or somebody, and either my summer student or somebody from the university, we'd be glad to come to your field and collect the cutworms. Or if you're out there and you start seeing a lot of them and you've got a container with you, grab a batch of them, put them in some soil, and again, get them into the ag office. They would send them to me or to the university, and we would try to rear those and find the parasites that are potentially in them. And that would really help us determine what our local population of parasites is like. So if you find them, let us know. We'd be glad to take your cutworms from you. Wireworms, that's one thing I'll just touch on briefly here. Wireworms are something that the last few years seem to be sporadic. A lot of areas seem to have lower levels, but then you get the odd area where they seem to be of concern. So patchy in their distribution. They're generalists. They feed on lots of crops, cereal crops, pulse crops, corn. They've got a very broad host range. Peas, they'll like to feed on. So they're one of these things you have to look for regardless of the crop. And right now is the time you'd be finding them. They tend to start feeding quite early. And first of all, just to give you a bit of background on their biology, here's your damaging stage. Here's the larva stage. That's what eats your seeds and roots. They are in the ground. They don't come out of the ground like most cutworms come out of the ground and feed on the leaves or cut stems, but wireworms spend their entire larva stage in the soil, so they're feeding on seeds and roots. And the biggest damage they will cause is when they're feeding on either the seeds or just as the seeds germinate, they feed on that hypocotyl and you get ragged, shredded leaves coming up. So if you start seeing that, again, dig around, see if it is potentially wireworms that you have. For anybody who's had wireworms recently and is trying to control them with seed treatments, in cereals you've got things like Cruiser Max cereals, you've got Raxol, Pulse Crops is a Cruiser blend as well, Cruiser Max beans or Cruiser Max Pulse. Those products do work, but what they do is they make the wireworms sick. They're not killing them, they're making them sick. So essentially they're intoxicating the wireworms and they don't feed for at least a few weeks. And it gives your crop enough time that it germinates well, it gets established, but then later in the season the wireworms start feeding again. But by then your crop is established. The little bit of root feeding they're going to do later is going to be really inconsequential for this year's yield. So your crop this year is protected. But the wireworms haven't been killed. So next year, if you are putting an even more sensitive crop in, such as, say, potatoes, or back to another pulse crop that might be quite sensitive, realize that last year's seed treatment didn't kill the wireworms. It just made them sick. So your crop got off to a good start, but you may still have wireworms there. Some of the older products actually killed the wireworms, but most of those products have been phased out. And unfortunately, most of the newer products are just products that make them sick and don't kill them. And the other thing I just wanted to mention, just to clear up some misconceptions, someone came back from a meeting out in the Southwest and was telling me that some of the people at the meeting were suggesting that grasshoppers were going to be a real big concern in the Southwest because of bare soil left from last year's flooding. And I just want to clear up the misconception here. Bare soil doesn't cause grasshopper problems or outbreaks. Dry weather can, but bare soil doesn't. And I guess the reason this misconception may get started is often if we do have 2 or 3 really dry years back to back to back, it does help, or at least it can help build up the grasshopper population. And often when you do have drought conditions, you do have some bare soil. So that maybe is where that connection got started. But again, it's not the bare soil that's going to cause grasshoppers. What happens in those drier years, grasshoppers don't like moist conditions, at least our local species, different in the tropics. But our local species don't like very moist, damp conditions. There's a fungus that kills a lot of them when it's quite damp and moist for prolonged periods. And if we get a lot of rain in early June, the grasshopper population gets hit really hard. A lot of the young grasshoppers get bloated, they get disease, they just don't do well if you have a very wet June. And if you have a very wet late August and September, the adults don't lay as many eggs. So generally speaking, a lot of rainy weather does not help the grasshoppers. At least it doesn't help them get their populations going. So having dry conditions for 2 or 3 years in a row will help the grasshoppers build their populations back up. But again, it's not the bare soil doing it, it's the release they're getting from some of their natural controls that's helping them build back, and the good conditions they have for egg laying. Those are the things that build the populations back up. And I just want to point out, we did do a grasshopper survey last year, as we always do. And when we do this survey, we're looking for higher populations, areas that might have higher risk going into the next year. But all the populations at egg laying time in August were quite low last year. Green on this map means low risk. And there's absolutely no yellow, orange, or red on this map. The grasshopper populations were quite low at egg laying time. Now, they did have very good conditions to lay eggs into. So the grasshoppers that were there had good egg-laying conditions, so and they've had good overwintering conditions. So things might start to build back. So we certainly won't have an outbreak year. Things don't go from low population to outbreak in 1 year. You could have localized problems. When they start building back, often you do get usually localized hotspots and problems. And if they get good conditions for a couple more years, that's when you can potentially get into outbreaks. So for this year, I'd be suggesting there may be some localized hotspots that need to be dealt with. We'll keep an eye open for those as the season goes along. But at this point, we really can't predict outbreak because of potential bare spots last year. There's no science to really be backing that up. So maybe what I'll do is I'll end with that and open up if there's any questions.
Hi, John. Lionel here. I just got actually a couple of questions for you. One question is, with the flea beetle thing and with the amount of land that was worked last fall, and also from talking to producers and with the better seeding equipment, we're getting guys sowing at lower seeding rates. Is that going to create more of an issue too?
Potentially can. I'm going to go back a few slides here to that. There we go. Again, this is the work from Lloyd Osso's study. So he did use a seeding rate in this study. And what you'll notice is at the higher seeding rates, there was a little bit less flea beetle seeding. I think what happens with seeding rate is you go to higher seeding rates, it dilutes the feeding a little bit. So you've got the same number of flea beetles in the field, but they're feeding on more plants at a higher seeding rate, so it just dilutes out that feeding. Lower seeding rates, it helps to concentrate the feeding. So you can get at least a little bit higher feeding per plant using the lower seeding rates. But you can see on the graph here the difference. Tillage made a much bigger difference than seeding rate did in the flea beetle feeding. The lower seeding rates, again, did increase the feeding pressure per plant somewhat, but not as much as having stubble or no stubble in the field.
Linda, is there any other questions?
There's a question here. It says, are diamondbacks influenced by heat units?
Diamondback moths are influenced by heat units. They will go through their generations quicker when it's warmer. So seeing as they're already here, this is a year where I would almost expect that we would get probably 4 generations, so 4 complete cycles of the diamondback moth population. Years when we don't start seeing them in our traps until late May or June, because they arrive late in those years, they only go through sometimes only 2, sometimes 3 generations. When they're here early like this, if we get a warm summer, I would expect probably at least 4 cycles. Cooler summer, possibly down to 3, but probably minimum 3 cycles this year, and maybe 4. And again, the heat units influence that. Warmer temperatures, more cycles. Now, what this means for you as a farmer, every time they go through one of these cycles, they have the potential to build that population up higher. But I use the word potential because if you have a lot of natural enemies, like last year we had this wasp called Cotesia, and if you have very high populations of some of these natural enemies, you don't see the population building every time they go through a generation. Things will sometimes plateau or even decline. So right now, I guess 2 things. They're here early. They have potential to go through a lot of cycles. There's potential for problems, but a lot's going to depend on what natural enemies are also present and whether they keep building on their population every time they go through one of these cycles.
Okay, John, I have one more picture that I'd like to show you, and then I guess, so Linda, if you could change my screen here, and then John, if I can get you just, I remember from a year ago, or a couple of years ago, I had this, was out in a field, and I seen this guy that looks similar to a wireworm, and I just couldn't remember his name, and I was kind of hoping I was going to surprise you and see if you could remember.
Yeah, okay. It's interesting that you've got that next to some cutworms too. What the white thing is a fly larva. The adult flies are called stiletto flies, and often the larvae we call them therivids. Therivid is the scientific name for this group. So a therivid or stiletto fly larva. These are predators. And I don't know if you noticed this, Lionel, but if you were to poke at that larva, they go snaky. They move really quickly, and they just start thrashing around. They're very quick. They're predators. They like feeding on earthworms, but they've also been recorded to feed on wireworms. I know young cutworms would be fair game as food. The older cutworms, hard to say if they would attack an older cutworm or not just because of size, but they are predaceous fly larvae, and they're good to have in your field. They will, again, if you've got wireworms in the field, because wireworms are a bit thinner than cutworms, they really like feeding on wireworms. So any insects in the soil, insects, worms, that's what they're going to feed on.
Good, thanks, John. Linda, was there any other questions for John?
There's a question here. It says, does spraying for diamondback early prior to flowering also affect the parasites?
Yeah, and unfortunately, it can, and probably will. Yeah, and the tricky part to that question too is that it depends to some degree on what parasite we have. Last year we had one called Cotesia, which we usually don't have as our dominant parasite of diamondback. Usually it's one called Diadegma. So it depends to some degree on the parasite, but I guess a simple answer is yes, it does. It does affect the parasite levels, and that's something you have to be cautious of. That's why we really recommend use the economic thresholds. Don't spray just because you've got a few and you're worried that down the line you could have a problem. Keep assessing it. If you're getting above our economic thresholds, then there's reason to treat. But don't be panicking and treating too early just in case, because in some years the parasites will do the job for you, and then it's free control in that case.
Okay, I have another question here, John. Someone is wanting to know what is the best type of container to transport cutworms, and would putting them in a plastic bag kill them?
Probably the best container would be a plastic, either margarine container, or a plastic container would probably work best. If they're going to be shipped fairly quickly, just put a little bit of soil in and put the cutworms in. Plastic bags would probably work, but the risk there is things can get squished, and as well as having no oxygen, things can get squished really easy. What I would suggest is if you're in the field and that's all you've got, certainly put them in a plastic bag. If you do have a sturdier plastic container that you can transfer them to for shipping, that would be better. But plastic bag is better than nothing if that's all you've got. And I don't want to create extra work for Lionel or people in the ag offices either. I'll put my contact information. Oh, I guess Lionel's got the screen. You can send them directly to me if you want. The quicker you can get them here, the better. Or, again, take them to the ag office, explain what they're for, and I'm sure they would send them to either myself or the university as quickly as they can.
Okay, I also have one here. Any comments on insecticide use and timing for cutworm control?
I'll answer the second part first because it's the easier one. As far as timing goes, certainly evening is, the later in the day you can spray, the better. Cutworms are nocturnal. They hide in the soil during the day. They come up at night to feed. So the later you can get the spray on, the better. Morning sprays aren't a great option for cutworms. You might get some kill. They still, especially on a cloudy morning, there still might be some upfeeding. But I know there have been times when I've been out early looking for cutworms, and it seems that as soon as the sun comes up, there are some that start going down into the soil already. So your best bet is to get the spray on as late as you can. That way, if they haven't completely started coming up out of the soil yet, they will be very shortly after you've gotten the spray on, and that'll be your best bet for control, is getting that spray on as late as possible. As far as staging-wise, certainly you don't want to spray too early. If it's redback cutworm, which, again, species makes a difference. If it's redback cutworm, which right now is in the egg stage, if you start spraying too early in the season, you run the risk of spraying twice. Now, the trade-off here is the young larvae aren't going to do as much damage as the older larvae, but you don't want to wait. You don't want to wait too long. You don't want to go too early. So what I would suggest is, if it's redback cutworm, now it's too early. They're probably just tiny little things that aren't doing a lot of damage yet. You'd probably want to wait a little while just to make sure the egg hatch is complete, and then go after them. And this is where species ID can be important. If it's something like dingy cutworm, which overwinters as larvae, their hatch was done last fall. So if you're starting to see damage and it's dingy cutworm, there's no more egg hatch, you're better off going sooner than later. Now, as far as products go, I don't like picking favorites, but the pyrethroid group is one group that seems to have very good success with cutworms. That's products like Desis, Matador, Ripcord. Those products seem to work quite well in tests. The OPs, organophosphates, do work well. Lorsban is in that group. Although in head-to-head tests that were done in Alberta, field tests, they did have their better control with the pyrethroids. But really, any of the products registered for cutworms will work quite well. And one other one that I should throw into the mix here, which I haven't seen head-to-head tests with, but I know works quite well, is Coragen. It's a new product that's out. And it's not registered in all crops, but I believe in corn and some field crops it's registered. And it does very good control of cutworms. And the good thing with that product is it is easy on natural enemies. It is quite selective in what it will kill. So you've got a few different products. Any of them that I don't think any of the ones that are registered, if you use them properly, you're not going to get poor kill. You'll get good kill if they're used properly under the right conditions and timed properly. And those are the more important things. Make sure you get the timing right.
Okay, Lionel, there are no more questions at this time.
Okay, great. Well, thanks a lot, John. And it was a good update and lots of good questions.
Okay, thank you.
So next thing I'm going to talk about is just a little bit about seed treatments. I've mentioned we've been getting some questions regarding, seed treatments, the value of seed treatments, when is the best time, or is there a time where I can maybe get away without using one? So basically we use seed treatments for a few things. We use it for the surface-borne disease, the soil ones, and for any of the internal diseases on the seed that we were planting, as well as diseases that are in the soil that we're planting into. So I'm just going to go through this chart here that kind of talks a little bit about some of the favorable conditions for diseases to occur in the soil. And right now, and I guess depending on where you're farming, but in the soil temps in the cool areas, which would be the area that we're experiencing, or the issues, or the type of soil we're working with right now, and our soil is moist, we'd be looking more at the Fusarium and the Rhizoctonia being our couple, our biggest issues, and in some of the areas, Pythium being one of the other ones that we'd be kind of most favorable conditions for those diseases to occur. Now, I guess it depends on where you are, but basically, most of the disease issues are the issues you'll be dealing with seedling diseases are in the soil, and they're going to vary from location to location. So the big concern here is the length of time the seed is in the ground before it actually comes through and starts growing. So I guess one of the biggest, or the most common one, is common root rot, and its symptoms are very similar to Fusarium. Infected plants are usually scattered throughout the field rather than in patches. Severely infected plants ripen prematurely, and we've all seen this. They stick out in green stands. The roots development is reduced, and the plants are easy to pull out of the soil. And I got a picture of it coming up as well. But here's just if you were to pull the roots out, a lot of times you'll see from the crown, you can see very poor hair development on the roots, staining of the roots, almost a browning of the roots, and very poor root development. Again, you can see pictures in the field here where it's kind of scattered plants, and I guess common to root rot. This is the picture I was wanting to show you, and we see this in the field quite a bit in the fall. You can go out there, you grab on these heads, and the roots, the whole plant comes out of the ground, not just at the first node. If it was the first node, then we'd be looking for an insect type issue. But when you yank on that, it comes right out of the ground, and usually a sign of root rot. And we've been seeing quite a bit of this over the last couple years in the southwest here. Fusarium root rot, symptoms do not appear until 2 or 3 weeks after planting. Initial symptoms include narrow, long red or brown lesions located on the base of the stem. Infected plants are usually stunted. If they do make it through the ground, if the roots get established, they are actually a poor root system, and it will affect nutrient uptake. You'll get a reduction in crop density and therefore yield loss. One of the things with a lot of the seedling diseases is you'll notice you'll get poor root development, you'll get either poor stooling, poor crop development, and it usually relates back afterwards to poor yield in those areas. Here's a case of some severe Fusarium on a plant. I actually found this on one of the websites, and just to show you that something like this would have basically just died off. But you can see where the Fusarium has actually affected the whole root system in the upper part of the plant just as it's going to be coming through the soil surface. You see the browning of the plant. So if you're looking for, you're seeing some problems up in the field and you want to determine if it's Fusarium root rot, dig up some of the weak plants and check their roots for signs of damage. You know, due to the severity and the impact of this disease, seed treatment is probably your best alternative. The plants are going to ripen prematurely. A lot of them, if it's affected early enough, so if you're seeing it at the time of seedling emergence, those ones are probably not going to make it through to actually establish any type of head. And but sometimes if it happens a little bit later, you can see the same symptoms as you would with common root rot, and as you pull it on the plant, the whole root system would come out. So it could be mistaken for root rot. But again, when you're dealing with this type of disease or these type of seedling diseases, your control or your treatment is going to be very similar. The Pythium root rot or browning root rot is normally a seedling disease causing reduced stands. So again, very common, everyone causing a reduced stand. Pythium is more common in soils that are very wet, and usually kind of thrives in soils where oxygen levels are low, and seeing areas where there's high rainfall. So over the last couple years, we probably can be seeing Pythium being more of an issue in a lot of the soils. And so again, just a difference between it and some of the other ones is this one kind of thrives on wet areas and be more of a damaging situation that way. And again, just to talk a little bit more about it, is damping off occurs frequently when germination takes place under wet conditions. Seedlings that are merged usually recover but may experience impaired root development and delayed maturity. So a lot of times the seedlings that are affected by Pythium may still make it and develop later on, but they're going to be later. A lot of these patches will also be showing yellowing symptoms throughout the growing season. And a lot of times you can mistake it for wet areas, and you'll see that while it's wet, yellowing because of the wet conditions, and a lot of times there's probably some underlying factors. If you were to dig up some of those plants, you would see the brown lesions on the roots, you would see the poor root development, and because of that you would see the root rot is actually being one of the factors, and it makes sense. If you have a root growing in a wet area, the root rot is definitely going to be a symptom that's going to be causing the plant to show the yellowing. Of the cereal crops, barley is more sensitive than wheat to this seedling disease. And just a picture of what you might see. You can see again from the seed, very poor seed root development from the seed, lesions going up the hypocotyl, and then very poor plant development above ground, mainly because it's the lack of nutrients, because you have a very poor root system. The last one I want to talk about is the Rhizoctonia root rot, and again it is a seedling blight, and again something that might be showing up on a year like this year from prolonged exposure to cold, very wet or dry soil, deep seeding or short crop rotations encourage these type of infections. So pretty much the symptoms that are the situation we're in right now. We're seeding into cold, wet soil. We're seeding into rotations that have been all screwed up because of the wet conditions. So this may be something we could be seeing out there as well. Seeds fail to germinate and become soft and pulpy, so sometimes you don't even get the germination, or you don't even get the plants coming through the soil surface. In dry conditions, you may get some of the plants coming through, but they don't develop very well. It could be scattered throughout the field, or you could see it in patches, and the best thing here would be is to dig up some of the plants and take a look at them and see what kind of development you have of the root system. And here's just an example of what you might see: healthy root here, and then on the right-hand side, poor root development, poor secondary root development, just a overall weaker plant. So just some general comments about the whole seed treatment thing. Most seedling diseases look fairly similar, so a lot of times when you're looking at the disease at the seedling stage, it's going to be very difficult to determine exactly which disease that you're looking at, and a lot of times it might need sending those samples away to get them confirmed. Most of the time when you're identifying the problem, you're probably after the fact, and control measures at that point in time are not going to be an option. If you're seeing problems out in the field and you've got poor germination problems, it looks like, or it looks like you got poor stands, or you got patchy spots in the field, at that point in time to do anything to try to control it is really, there's nothing you can do. So in a kind of a general recommendation from myself is when seeding into cold soils, we should be looking at seed treating. There's several products available, but the main issue is that if you're seeding into cold, wet soils, the seed is going to sit there for a long time before it comes through. We've got guys that have planted some crop, been in the ground for 2 weeks. It still hasn't come through the ground yet. It's sitting in cool, wet soil. There are several factors in the soil that are going to be affecting that plant and germination of that seed. Seed treatments will definitely be the answer there, because they'll help keep some of those plants healthy for a long period of time. Some of the seed treatments actually help the plant get going and get growing, and because of that, you do get that pop-out effect, and once the plant is through the ground, its ability to fight off some of the seedling diseases is improved quite a bit. The biggest thing is if you're really questioning seed treatment, if we do get into a situation and we're later on in the growing season and we're starting to experience, 20-degree days and warm evenings, the length of time that seed is going to sit in the ground is going to be reduced from right now we're looking at 2 weeks plus to maybe 5 days later on in the growing season here. And in those situations, you may start wondering if you should be looking at seed treating, and you probably could get away with it in at a lot of times where you can reduce that expense. One caution for this year as compared to other years is we are seeding into a lot of different situations this year as well. We're sowing into wheat stubbles, wheat into wheat stubbles, or wheat into land that wasn't worked last year but had a lot of volunteer cereal on it, and so a lot of the soil could be sitting there with high levels of inoculum in them to affect seedlings, and for the cost of a seed treatment, it might just be worth your while this year to be doing that just to make sure your plant is off and going. The other thing, if you are seeding late, you probably want that plant to come out as fast as it can and to be as healthy as it can be. Again, another reason why a seed treatment might be your option there, just to get it going and give it every advantage it can. So for this year, I guess a general recommendation is I would definitely be looking at the seed treatments, and that's just one thing to I guess improve your crop stand for the beginning of the year. With that, I guess it's going to be the last part of the seed treatment. And Linda, is there any questions about seed treatments?
No, we don't have any questions at this time, Lionel.
Okay, I'm going to put up the slide again then where if you have questions or you want to get a hold of Linda or myself, these are the two numbers for the STIRS Go office, and then the other Go offices throughout the Southwest. You have Elmer and Murray and Amir and Andrea in the other offices, so if you need to get a hold of somebody, or if you're collecting samples for John and want to get some samples off to him, I'm sure if you drop them off at these offices, they can forward it on for you. So I guess with that, we are just about at the hour, so I'd like to thank everybody for attending, and we'll see you next week.